It looked like a simple family portrait, nothing more than a moment frozen in time. A father standing proudly beside his wife, two daughters seated before them, ribbons in their hair, the faintest smiles on their faces. The year was 1903, the air outside thick with autumn fog, and inside the Whitaker home, a single photograph was about to immortalize what seemed like happiness. But when the film was developed that night, the photographer, Thomas Avery, never made it to morning. He collapsed on the cold floor of his dark room, the photograph still wet in his trembling hands. Because behind the family, reflected faintly in the tall silver mirror, was something else. Something that should not have been there. A figure, tall, thin, with a blurred, almost human face, smiling where no one had stood. Its hand rested gently on the youngest child's shoulder, its expression too knowing, too alive. The image was perfect in exposure, flawless in technique, but the reflection told another story. A story of something ancient, patient and unseen, waiting quietly for the shutter to open. And once it did, it was captured forever. This truth begins in the quiet countryside of southern England, Dorset, 1903. A place where fog crept through the meadows like a living thing, swallowing the narrow streets and staring at the sound of church bells at dawn. It was the Edwardian era, a time of invention, beauty, and the firm belief that science could explain everything. Electricity flickered hesitantly in the homes of the wealthy. The smell of coal smoke and rain hung forever in the air. And photography, that strange art of trapping light and memory, had become the latest craze of the upper middle class. Families across Britain sat stiffly in front of cameras, hoping to preserve their faces forever on delicate plates of glass. This was the new immortality, to be remembered not by name but by image. But not all photographs tell the truth. Deep in a damp valley near the quiet village of Woodborough, there stood a house that the locals spoke of only in whispers. The house whose windows never glowed with heat, whose garden grew wild no matter how often it was trimmed. Hawthorne Grange, a tall Victorian mansion of dark red brick that had almost turned black with age and weather. The chimneys never stopped smoking, even on clear, windless days. The iron gate creaked open when no one touched it. The walls echoed with the sound of breathing, the echo of footsteps that were not those of a living person. During the day, sunlight fell on the glass panes and threw long streaks of gold across the garden, but by night, the windows reflected nothing. It was said that if you stood in front of them after midnight, your reflection would not appear, and if it did, it would not move when you did. Inside this house lived the Whitakers, a respectable family, wealthy enough to live comfortably, but not enough to move away from the cold valley that watched them. Dr. Charles Whitaker, his wife Eleanor, and their two daughters, Margaret and Alice, the picture of civility and grace. No one could have imagined that the portrait he would take that autumn, a simple photograph, would bring them all to life. And in time, it would be whispered about in every parlor, printed in every local newspaper, and remembered as one of the most haunting images ever taken in the history of British photography. At first glance, the Whitakers were the picture of ordinary happiness, the kind of family one might see on the cover of a parish newsletter or in the pews every Sunday. Dr. Charles Whitaker, the patriarch, was a country physician of gentle demeanor and steady hands. His patients spoke of him with reverence, saying his very presence could calm a feverish child. His wife Eleanor possessed a quiet grace, always dressed in soft shades of ivory or lilac, her hair pinned neatly beneath a lace bonnet. She spent her afternoons tending to her rose garden or playing hymns on the old walnut piano that had been her mother's. Their daughters, Margaret and Elise, 9 and 6 years old, were inseparable. They played hide-and-seek among the hedges, collecting wildflowers and chasing butterflies down the cobblestone path. Their laughter often floated through the still Dorset air, mixing with the scent of lilac and freshly baked bread. To neighbors, the Whitakers seemed flawless, the happiest family in Dorset, they'd say. Every morning, Charles walked the short lane to his clinic, tipping his hat to the baker, the blacksmith, and the postman. Eleanor would wave from the porch, sunlight catching the silver in her wedding ring. In the evenings, she lit candles in the long hallway lined with mirrors. An elegant corridor where every reflection seemed to whisper a different version of the truth. It was in that same hallway, bathed in candlelight and shadow, that the Whitakers decided to take their family portrait. They wanted something beautiful to mark the turn of the century, a photograph to hang above the fireplace for generations, and so, on October 9, 1903, a traveling photographer named Thomas Avery arrived at Hawthorne Grange. He came by horse-drawn carriage, carrying his heavy mahogany camera, a tripod, and a box of fragile glass plates. The fog was thick that morning, curling around his boots like ghostly fingers. He would later recall the house as strangely quiet, as though it were listening. The morning of October 9th began with a quiet chill. The mist hung low over the hedgerows, and the air carried the faint metallic scent of rain. Inside Hawthorne Grange, the Whitakers prepared carefully for their portrait. Dr. Charles Whitaker buttoned his dark wool coat, brushing a few stray threads from the lapel. Eleanor descended the staircase in her ivory gown trimmed with lace, her reflection flickering faintly in the mirrors that lined the hall. The children, Margaret and Elise, were dressed in pale linen, ribbons tied neatly in their hair. They sat close together on the parlor bench, their small hands intertwined. Thomas Avery, the photographer, worked in silence. He positioned his camera near the tall window where thin daylight spilled across the faded wallpaper. Behind the family hung an elaborate silver oak mirror, a relic from another century. Locals whispered that it once belonged to a family who had perished mysteriously in the same house long before the Whitakers arrived. Avery adjusted his focus. "Now, hold very still." The camera's shutter released with a long mechanical sigh. The sound lingered, heavy and unnatural, before fading into stillness. Moments later, it was over. Avery thanked them politely, packed his fragile glass plates, and disappeared into the heavy Dorset fog. The Whitakers resumed their quiet routines, unaware that something uninvited had entered their lives that day, something that had found its way into the frame. That night, in the dim glow of an oil lamp, Avery began developing the photograph inside his small rented darkroom at the village inn. The scent of silver nitrate filled the air. Slowly the image surfaced on the plate. Faint outlines at first, then faces: Charles, Eleanor, Margaret, Elise. Perfect, serene, frozen in time. But as the background sharpened, Avery's hand began to tremble. The reflection in the mirror was wrong. Behind the family stood a fifth figure, tall, thin, its face obscured, its posture rigid. Its head tilted slightly, as if staring directly at him through the photograph. Avery leaned closer. The reflection's hand, long, skeletal, rested gently on the youngest girl's shoulder. He dropped the plate. His breath quickened. No, that can't be. By dawn, Thomas Avery was dead. They found him collapsed beside the developing tray, eyes wide open, mouth frozen mid-scream. The photograph lay beside him, perfectly dried, perfectly clear, and in the mirror the fifth figure, still standing there. When word of Thomas Avery's death reached Hawthorne Grange, the Whitakers were deeply unsettled, though Dr. Charles dismissed it as coincidence. A man of science, he believed in infection, not superstition. In reason, not ghosts, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something darker lingered behind the tragedy. A week later, the constable delivered the photograph to their doorstep, wrapped neatly in brown paper. Eleanor insisted on seeing it herself. She brought it into the breakfast room, the morning light dull through the misted windows. Charles unfolded the wrapping carefully, and then froze. The photograph slid from his fingers. In the mirror's reflection, the shadow was no longer faint. It was a man, tall, pallid, smiling in a way that made the skin crawl. His head tilted unnaturally, his eyes black hollows of light. It was as if he had been there all along, patiently waiting to be noticed. Eleanor's hand trembled. "It must be an error of light," she whispered, though her voice betrayed disbelief. Margaret, the older daughter, leaned forward, staring silently at the photo. After a long pause, she said softly, "Mother, he was in my dream last night." That was the beginning. Soon, small changes crept into the house. Doors that had been locked were found open. Mirrors fogged over even when no one breathed nearby. At night, faint footsteps crossed the upstairs landing. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth outside the children's room. Charles, desperate to restore order, removed every mirror from the house, including the ornate one from the parlor. He stored them all in the attic, nailing the door shut. But the disturbances only deepened. A low humming began to drift through the halls at night, soft, mournful, and oddly childlike. Eleanor swore it came from the attic, though the family avoided going near it. Then, one morning, the maid screamed. She had discovered tiny fingerprints smeared on the inside of Elise's bedroom mirror, the same mirror that was supposed to be locked away. The following dawn, Elise was found sitting upright in bed, her skin white as porcelain, whispering over and over, "He was watching me from the glass." A week later, Margaret was gone. Her bed untouched. Her shoes are still neatly by the door. Only her footprints trailed into the fog outside and stopped halfway across the field. No one ever found her. By the spring of 1904, Hawthorne Grange stood silent. The windows were shuttered, the gardens wild with weeds, and the name Whittaker was spoken only in whispers. Then, quite by chance, a local historian named Henry Barrow came across a bundle of damp, yellowed papers in the archives of Dorset's Parish Hall. They were Dr. Charles Whittaker's private notes, his handwriting uneven, his words desperate. In those pages, a different man emerged. No longer the rational physician, but a haunted observer documenting something far beyond medicine. Charles wrote that the mirror, the ornate silver oak one, was not simply a reflection of the living. It was, in his words, a vessel for memory, a surface that absorbs the last image of whatever dies before it. He traced its origins to Edwin Harker, a 19th century spiritualist and occultist who had lived at Hawthorne Grange long before the Whittakers. Harker had held seances, speaking of the veil between worlds and his belief that mirrors were gateways for the souls of the dead. When Harker died mysteriously in 1869, his body was found before that same mirror, his eyes wide, pupils dilated, frozen in a gaze of absolute terror. Charles believed the mirror still carried the echo of that death. He confessed that over time he began seeing faces in its depths, faint outlines of people who weren't there. Sometimes he felt watched while passing by it. Sometimes he heard whispers behind the glass speaking his name. His last entry was short, written in a trembling hand. "The mirror remembers. It knows what it has seen, and now it sees me." After that, nothing. Weeks later, a search party entered Hawthorne Grange. The air inside was heavy, still, and ice cold. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no bodies. Every mirror in the house was shattered, except one. Above the fireplace hung the family portrait. But it was no longer the same. The faces of Charles, Eleanor, and Elise had begun to fade, their expressions ghostly and drained of life, the edges of their figures dissolving into the background. And in the mirror behind them, the fifth figure had sharpened into perfect clarity. It looked human now. Its smile is broader. Its eyes are bright and alive, as though it had finally taken their place. After the Whittakers vanished, Hawthorne Grange became a scar on the Dorset countryside, a place the locals crossed themselves to avoid. No one dared to walk past it after dusk. The once elegant manor was soon swallowed by ivy and silence. Its roof sagged under the weight of endless rain, the windows blackened with soot, reflecting nothing but the fog that lingered there year-round. The few who entered never stayed long. Caretakers, surveyors, even thieves, all left within days, shaken, pale, muttering about voices in the glass. They said mirrors in the house would crack in unison, as though struck by unseen hands. Those reflections whispered faintly, repeating words the living never spoke. And sometimes at the top of the staircase, one could hear the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing toward the parlor, stopping where the portrait once hung. In 1921, the local diocese sent a priest, Father Alaric Moore, to perform a cleansing ritual. He stayed inside the house for 3 nights. When he returned, his hair had turned completely white. He spoke little, only writing a brief letter before leaving Dorset for good. Listen to this. The air is not empty in that house. There are eyes everywhere, waiting behind the mirrors. The photograph must never be displayed. It is not an image. It is an opening. He sealed the portrait in a lead-lined box, burying it deep beneath the crypt of St. Bartholomew's Church. For 2 decades, it remained undisturbed. Then, in 1942, the church was struck during a German air raid. The archives burned. The crypt collapsed. The burial site of the photograph was lost forever. But evil, it seems, does not rest easily. In the years that followed, fragments of the Whitaker photograph began to reappear. Small, grainy copies passed between collectors of the macabre. No one knew how they survived. Some claimed Avery had made duplicates before his death. In 1972, one such print surfaced at a private auction in London. The image was blurred, but the figure in the mirror was unmistakable, clearer than ever. The winning bidder, a reclusive antiques dealer, never arrived to collect his purchase. 2 days later, he was found dead in his flat, impaled by shards of a broken picture frame. The photo was gone. Today, the ruins of Hawthorne Grange still stand, deep in the forgotten valleys of Dorset. The path leading there has almost vanished beneath ivy and thorns, and only the locals can tell you where to find it. They say the air changes when you approach. The wind turns cold, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and lavender, the same fragrance Eleanor Whitaker was known to wear. At night, the house feels alive again. Crows roost along the crumbling chimneys, their wings cutting through the mist like black shrouds. The windows, what remains of them, gleam faintly as if reflecting a light that doesn't exist. If you stand at the rusted gate and listen carefully, you can still hear the faint, rhythmic click of an old camera shutter, a sound swallowed by time, yet somehow echoing across the years. Some who pass by claim to see a flicker in the dark, the outline of a mirror, leaning crookedly against what once was the parlor wall. Most turn back before getting too close, but a few, driven by curiosity, have shone their flashlights toward the house. And that's when they say it happens. A glint in the glass, a soft movement in the reflection. And then, 4 figures appear, a man, a woman, 2 little girls, the Whitakers, still frozen in that eternal pose, their smiles faint but visible through the dust. And behind them, unmistakable even after more than a century, the 5th figure, standing silently in the shadows of the mirror, its head tilted in that same unnatural way. Waiting, because some reflections don't fade, some souls never leave, and some houses remember everything that ever looked into their glass. Even now, locals warn that taking photos near Hawthorne Grange is dangerous. Several have claimed their images came out wrong. Blurred faces, dark silhouettes standing where no one stood. One man even reported that his reflection smiled back. Long after he'd stopped, the Whitaker family was never found. But if you believe in mirrors that hold memory, maybe they never truly left, and perhaps they're still waiting for someone new to join their portrait, because the truth, as always, was never buried. It was just waiting to be found. If you dare to uncover more forgotten horrors from our world's darkest corners, subscribe to Truth Uncaged and turn on the bell so you never miss the next story that should have stayed hidden. Until then, don't look too long into the mirror.